Shalom, me homies. It's Alex with Formidable Felons, and I am here today talking about the investigation of the Lowell Correctional Institution in Florida with FDOC, the Florida Department of Corrections. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe. I'm trying to grow the channel, and I promise you this one's going to be very, very interesting. We're going to start at the beginning of the of the investigation. It's by the United States Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, in the United States Attorney's Office, Middle District of Florida. It was published on December 22nd, 2020. So I'll quickly go through the table of contents. First, we have the summary, on page 1, the investigation on page 2, Lowell Correctional Institution and FDOC, page 3, that's just the history of it and everything. On the conditions identified are on page 4, which include the A, staff sexual abuse of Lowell prisoners that violates prisoners' constitutional rights. B, that's on page 4 as well. B, inadequate systems for preventing, detecting, and responding to sexual abuse place Lowell prisoners at substantial risk of serious harm from staff sexual abuse. That's on page 13. And C, officials at Lowell knew of the risk to prisoners from staff sexual abuse and disregarded it. And that ends on page 30. We have the minimal remedial measures that were taking place on page 33 and conclusion on page 34. So to begin with the summary, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Middle District of Florida, the Department, provide notice pursuant to the civil rights of institutionalized persons that there is reasonable cause to believe, based on the totality of the conditions, practices, and incidents discovered, that 1. Conditions at the Lowell Correctional Institution, Lowell, violate the 8th Amendment of the United States Constitution due to the sexual abuse of prisoners by the facility's staff, and 2. These violations are pursuant to a pattern or practice of resistance to the full enjoyment of rights protected by the 8th Amendment. And we don't mean literal enjoyment of rights as a prisoner. We mean just being able to have your basic rights. The department does not serve as a tribunal authorized to make factual findings and legal conclusions binding on or admissible in any court, and nothing in this notice of investigative conclusions should be construed as such. Accordingly, this notice is not intended to be admissible evidence and does not create any legal rights or obligations. Specifically, the United States provides notice that the state of Florida, through the Florida Department of Corrections, FDOC, fails to keep prisoners at Lowell safe from sexual abuse by staff. FDOC has documented and been aware of a pattern or practice of staff sexual abuse of Lowell prisoners since at least 2006. Despite being on notice of the sexual abuse, FDOC and Lowell failed to take timely action to remedy the systemic problems that have enabled corrections officers and other staff to continue to sexually abuse Lowell prisoners. In my time there, I fortunately was not sexually abused, and I did hear of it happening on the compound, and I do want to let it be known that there are definitely inmates that are willing, and usually it is for a period of time, and if they want to stop, that's taken away from them. Any rights that they are left with, regardless of the external benefits that they had from the affair, any regular rights that they had as a prisoner are usually taken away when they decide to say no. This is why officers, when they take this position, they are supposed to be entrusted with inmates' lives. That is why, in a sense, inmates do not have consent. You are not supposed to be in a relationship with someone that you have control over. All right, so to continue, as documented in this notice, Lowell prisoners have suffered harm from sexual abuse and are at substantial risk of serious harm because existing systems discourage prisoners from reporting sexual abuse and fail to effectively detect and deter sexual abuse. Between 2017 and the present, Lowell sergeants, corrections officers, and other staff have committed notorious acts of sexual abuse, including rape against prisoners. For example, in July 2020, a sergeant was arrested and charged with sexual misconduct after he admitted to engaging in oral sex with a prisoner in the maintenance room of a prisoner dormitory as recently as April 2020. That same sergeant had been accused in 2017 of sexually abusing a different prisoner, causing lesions on the prisoner's throat from oral sex, and then retaliating against the prisoner when she refused his sexual advances. This is what I was talking about. Even though FDOC verified the prisoner's injuries, FDOC never completed the investigation for the 2017 incident, and the officer remained employed until his arrest in July 2020, which is a common habit you'll see throughout this. They start the investigation, they never finish it, and then it happens again, and then they're like, okay, we'll fire the guy now. This recent staff arrest is not an isolated incident. The department identified evidence that Lowell has a long-standing pattern of criminal charges, discipline, and documented allegations of staff sexual abuse. In 2018, another sergeant allegedly raped a prisoner in a storage area, pulling her pants down and forcing his penis in anally. Extensive photographic evidence documented the prisoner's injuries. See, this is exactly what I mean about that as well. You're supposed to be serving your time in prison. Going to prison doesn't include being raped. People say, don't do the time if you can't, don't do the crime if you can't do the time. They don't know what's going on behind closed doors. They don't know that people are in here getting raped. This is why this investigation was published. This is why I'm bringing it to you guys. Another officer allegedly took a prisoner to an outdoor area between two buildings, pushed her down, and forced his penis into her mouth. Prisoners repeatedly told the Department of officers making harassing, sexually explicit comments to them. One prisoner alleged in 2018 that an officer boasted to her that he had a large penis and made graphic comments suggesting he wanted to perform oral sex on a black woman. It is common for officers to grope prisoners, including their buttocks and breasts, bribe prisoners with contraband, including drugs, cigarettes, food, and makeup, in exchange for sex, comment on prisoners' bodies using crude sexual language, names, and compel prisoners into ongoing abusive sexual relationships, watch prisoners as they use the toilet or shower and when changing clothes without justification, and threaten prisoners with solitary confinement if they report sexual abuse. And even when you're in solitary confinement, there's also the chance of getting sexually abused as well. Consistent with the statutory requirements of CRIPA, the department writes this notice to notify the state of Florida of our conclusions with respect to these constitutional violations, the facts supporting those conclusions, and the minimum remedial measures necessary to address the identified deficiencies. Part 2 is the investigation. So on April 17th, 2018, the department notified the state of Florida of our intent to conduct an investigation of Lowell pursuant to CRIPA. Our investigation focused on whether there is a reasonable cause to believe that Lowell violates the constitutional rights of women prisoners by failing to take measures to reasonably protect them from harm of staff sexual abuse during their incarceration at Lowell. On July 9th, 2018, August 15th, 2018, and November 19th, 2018, the department issued subpoenas for documents and information to relevant state and facility officials. In August 2018 and November 2019, representatives from the department conducted 4-day on-site reviews of Lowell. An expert consultant in the correctional operations and sexual safety of incarcerated persons assisted with our investigation and participated in the on-site reviews. Our expert is a former warden of a women's prison with 35 years of experience working with corrections and other criminal justice-related organizations. I really appreciate that they took the time to get someone with experience in a women's prison. That was actually a woman as well. We have so many men trying to take control over women's bodies right now. I'm so happy that in the investigation they chose to have a woman there with that experience. So in preparation for and during our on-site reviews, we reviewed documentation produced by Lowell and FDOC. Over the course of on-site reviews, we toured the Lowell campus at different time intervals. We observed and met with prisoners in various settings throughout the facility, including all security levels, vocational programs, and restrictive housing units. We conducted an exit conference with Lowell and FDOC officials upon the conclusion of our August 2018 visit in order to provide transparency and technical assistance during the course of the investigation. FDOC officials, the Lowell administration and staff, and their legal representatives cooperated with and facilitated our on-site reviews. Following our on-site reviews, we requested, and the state produced, additional documentation relevant to our investigation. Throughout the course of our investigation, the state produced over 108,505 pages of documents. The department and its expert conducted extensive document review of policies and procedures, staffing information, prisoner files, incident reports, investigative reports, disciplinary reports, administrative audit reports, prisoner grievances, unit logs, orientation materials, training materials, and quality assurance materials. FDOC's Office of the Inspector General, OIG, also cooperated with the department by providing additional clarifying information and documentation throughout the course of the investigation. The state also updated information as to its efforts to address issues related to sexual abuse. We're going to continue with part 3 after I get my cat, because he keeps meowing. Come here, Caviar. Come on. This is Caviar. Meow. All right. You okay? All right. So, part 3, I have one of his hairs in my eye. Featuring Caviar. Part 3. Lowell Correctional Institution and FDOC. Lowell is located in... Oh, hi, tiny cat. Come here. Tiny cat. He doesn't like to be held. Sorry about that, guys. Okay. Part 3. Lowell is located in Ocala, Florida, about an hour and a half north of Orlando. It is the oldest women's prison in Florida, having opened in 1956, and is the largest women's prison in the country. Lowell sits on approximately 315 acres of land. The Lowell campus the Lowell campus is comprised of the Lowell Correctional Institution, the main unit, the Lowell Annex, and the Lowell Work Camp. On November 19th, 2019, the population of the main unit was 893, and the population of the annex was 1,371, for a total of 2,264 in the two facilities. I did my time on the main unit in Victor Dorm as one of the EDP, the Extended Day Program youth prisoners, a YO youth offender. So the population includes adult women and youthful inmates, as I said, YOs. It also houses pregnant prisoners, prisoners who use wheelchairs, deaf prisoners, and prisoners with other disabilities. The facility holds all custody levels to include community, minimum, medium, close, and maximum. The number of staff in the entire Lowell campus who have contact with prisoners is 595. The physical plant of Lowell consists of 74 buildings. I'll try to show a map of it, of which 27 are designated for prisoner housing. What they don't say is that half of them are abandoned. The Lowell main unit has 14 housing units, 12 are open bay dormitories, and 2 are celled housing. The ones that are open bays that are not inside, they do not have any air conditioning at all, and it gets super hot in Florida. Nothing like Texas weather at all, and the things that they have to go through in their jails. But for women that are already going through hot flashes and whatnot, and I think we're past that point. We should just provide air conditioning at this level that we are in 2022. Okay, so the physical plan of Lowell consists of 74 buildings. I already read that part. I'm sorry, guys. The Lowell Annex has 8 housing units, 5 are open bay dorms, and 3 are celled housing, with one of 3 having 6 death row cells that are single celled. And when you walk into the annex, you can see there's 4 different areas. And when you go in to the right side over by Sierra Dorm is where they have the death row inmates. And I remember going to confinement one time and they were outside. They were just sitting on the ground. It was 2 girls. And I got home and I was able to watch the documentary about the girls. And just check that out. I'll try to link it down below. But I was grateful that I had family to go home to and that I had a minimal amount of time. But it is a very interesting thing to have to conquer mentally, knowing that there are people that nobody else gets to see. Everything's behind closed doors, as I always say. But I wish I could talk to them. I wish that I could provide some type of friendship for the amount of things that women have to deal with at Lowell, period. I'm sure that they're mistreated. All right. So the Lowell main unit also has 1 chapel, 10 classrooms, 2 dining halls, and 1 visitation park. Apparently the visitation park, back according to the older inmates, it used to have a whole bunch of trees, and you used to have your family would be able to go into the actual FDOC is the third largest state prison system in the country with an annual budget of $2.4 billion. It is the largest state agency in Florida. FDOC houses approximately 96,000 prisoners in its 145 correctional facilities statewide. Of these, approximately 6,600 are women in 14 facilities. FDOC Secretary Mark S. Inch took office in January 2019, becoming the seventh secretary since 2006. FDOC includes the OIG, which is responsible for investigating criminal and administrative violations, as well as audits to detect fraud, waste, and abuse. The operationally independent OIG falls under the administrative umbrella of FDOC and is funded by FDOC. I'm not going to read this. Well, no, I will. Sorry, the term youthful inmate is any person under the age of 18 who is under adult court supervision and incarcerated or detained in prison or jail. Closed management is the confinement of an inmate apart from the general population for reasons of security or the order and effective management of the institution where the inmate, through his or her behavior, has demonstrated an inability to live in the general population without abusing the rights and privileges of others. The last part in late June 2020, Inspector General Lester Fernandez resigned, reportedly under pressure from FDOC leadership after voicing concerns about FDOC's support of OIG's investigative mandate. And there's also references to the Samantha J. Gross Florida prisons among nation's deadliest. Didn't like demanding watchdog. He's gone. That is a different article. Now we're going to get to the conditions identified, which is going to be what actually happened to inmates and what they have on record. Zoom out a little bit more. So FDOC and Lowell are violating the Constitution by failing to protect prisoners from serious harm and a substantial risk of serious harm. See Farmer versus Brennan and Helling versus McKinney. The department's investigation has uncovered facts that provide reasonable cause to conclude that Lowell, 1, fails to protect women prisoners from sexual abuse by staff in violation of the 8th Amendment, and 2, exposes women prisoners to substantial risk of serious harm from sexual abuse in violation of the 8th Amendment. Systemic failures in Lowell's policies and practices discourage reporting of sexual abuse, led to an inadequate response to and investigation of allegations of sexual abuse, and result in grossly inadequate supervision that provides opportunities for further sexual abuse. By the way, just in case everyone has forgot, I don't know it word for word, but the 8th Amendment, I believe it has to do with cruel and inhumane punishment. I did just take this class, so I should know. Yes, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments Systemic inflicted. Failures in Lowell's policies and practices discourage reporting of sexual abuse, lead to an inadequate response to an investigation of allegations of sexual abuse, and result in grossly inadequate supervision that provides opportunities for further sexual abuse. As detailed below, the combination of numerous specific and repeated violations of the 8th Amendment at Lowell, taken together with multiple deficient policies and practices that caused or contributed to these violations, establishes a pattern or practice of constitutional violations. CRIPA authorizes the Attorney General to investigate and take appropriate action to enforce the constitutional rights of prisoners whose rights were violated, subject to a pattern or practice of unconstitutional conduct or conditions. To establish a pattern or practice of violations, the United States must establish by a preponderance of the evidence that violating federal law was standard operating procedure, the regular rather than the unusual practice. This is referencing HIP versus Liberty National Life Insurance, quoting international, I don't know what BHD is, I should have looked it up. If you know, please let me know in the comments, of Teamsters versus the United States. This was in 1977, that one. In some sections, we provide more examples to illustrate the variety of circumstances in which the violations occur, while in others we focus on 1 or 2 examples that demonstrate the nature of the violations we found. The number of examples included in a particular section is not indicative of the number of violations that we found. These examples comprise a small subset of the total number of incidences upon which we base our conclusions. Staff sexual abuse of Lowell prisoners violates prisoners' constitutional rights. 1. Failure to protect prisoners from harm from sexual abuse violates the 8th Amendment. The 8th Amendment governs the treatment a prisoner receives in prison and the conditions under which she is or he is confined. Prisons are required under the 8th Amendment to protect prisoners from a range of types of harm and to take reasonable measures to protect prisoners' safety. The unnecessary and wanton infliction of pain constitutes cruel and unusual punishment forbidden by the Eighth Amendment. This is where we get to the seriousness of people, like I said before, don't do the crime if you can't do the time. It doesn't include violating the Eighth Amendment. Even though you are a prisoner, your rights are taken away to a certain extent where in certain states you can't vote. Thank God in Florida we got that right back. I voted last year. And there's so many instances where people think that this is appropriate because you're a prisoner, and that's not the case. This is unconstitutional. Okay. The Eighth Amendment protects prisoners from sexual abuse even when there's no serious physical injury. This is Scarniers versus Lockhart. Sorry if I butchered that. Holding that an Eighth Amendment claim of sexual assault where a corrections officer digitally penetrated a prisoner's anus through his pants did not fail as a matter of law, and such a claim was not barred even if any resulting injuries were de minimis, meaning minimal. Sexual misconduct by corrections officers and other prison staff can violate the Eighth Amendment regardless of whether physical force is used. That's what I'm saying. And when they take their position that they are in charge of this person's life, you are in control of them. You are, even if they consent, it's not the typical consent. That's someone that is not in prison, someone that is free and has the ability to leave. It's an abusive relationship in a sense. If the person stops, they decide they don't want to do it anymore, it could become very dangerous, as I said previously. It says that was the the lack of serious injury considered in a vacuum cannot snuff out Eighth Amendment sexual assault claims. That's the Crawford versus Cuomo case in 2015. To show that an incident or series of incidents was serious enough to implicate the Constitution, an inmate need not allege that there was penetration, physical injury, or direct contact with uncovered genitalia. Meaning, basically, you don't have to penetrate them. If you grope them, if you are staring at them in the shower, as they said, these are the things that are still violating the Eighth Amendment. To establish a prison's official's deliberate indifference, a complainant must meet both objective and subjective requirements of this standard. Specifically, the claimant must show facts presenting an objectively substantial risk to prisoners and awareness of these facts on the part of the officials charged with deliberate indifference, and two, that the officials drew the subjective inference from known facts that a substantial risk of serious harm existed, and three, that the officials responded in an objectively unreasonable manner. The subjective component requires that the prison official acted with a sufficiently culpable state of mind, while an objective component requires that the alleged wrongdoing was objectively harmful enough to establish a constitutional violation. End quote. This is the Hudson versus McMillian case in 1992. The prison officials need not be complicit in the harmful acts, nor have specific knowledge that a particular prisoner is suffering abuse. It is enough that the official acted or failed to act despite his knowledge of a substantial risk of serious harm. Prison officials who are aware of substantial risk to prisoner safety must respond reasonably to the risk in order to ensure reasonable safety, noting that prison officials may avoid liability if they responded reasonably to the risk, even if the harm ultimately was not averted. So they don't really explain what reasonably is. And this also goes back to the lack of training that I feel police officers have in the United States, and also training for corrections officers. People lose people. Like in a rehab, you're trained to deal with crisis intervention as well. I'm going to school for human services. I'm getting my bachelor's degree. You're supposed to be able to help people when they are grieving. In places like this, people are serving 20, 30 years. They're losing people back to back to back. And sometimes they act out and they don't have an outlet. And this is other than the sexual part, but just the fact that there's no way to define a reasonable, how do I put it? There's no way to define a reasonable response. They don't define it for you. And it's really hard when you have people that are suffering from things that prison staff are doing to them, also things that they're handling internally. So whether a prison official had the requisite knowledge of a substantial risk is a question of fact, subject to demonstration in the usual ways, including inference from circumstantial evidence. prisoner has a right secured by the Eighth Amendment to be reasonably protected from sexual abuse. This is the Diamond versus Owens case, quoting Purcell and the estate of Morgan versus Toombs County in Georgia, and this was in 2005. Some things are never acceptable, no matter the circumstances. Sexual abuse is one. I absolutely agree with that. And this is in 2005. They made it a point of this, and there's ongoing abuse from 2006, as we saw from the beginning of the article. Sexual abuse of a prisoner by a corrections officer has no legitimate peniological purpose. Absolutely true. There's no reason why you need to punish someone who's already serving time, who's already been sentenced. They're already doing time in prison. There's already so much they have to deal with. There's no way someone can deserve the additional punishment of being raped, of being molested, of being groped. So there's no legitimate peniological purpose. If the purpose of an official's action is to gratify himself or to sadistically and maliciously cause harm, then sexually assaultive behavior constitutes an Eighth Amendment violation. Absolutely. This is quoting the Crawford case Johnson versus Breeden in 2002. In an Eighth Amendment analysis, an officer's intent to harm can be inferred not only from behavior that is injurious or malicious, but also from behavior whose purpose is to sexually gratify the officer or to humiliate the victim. Also very common. A corrections officer's intentional contact with an inmate's genitalia or other intimate area, which serves no peniological purpose and is undertaken with the intent to gratify the officer's sexual desire or to humiliate the inmate, violates the Eighth Amendment. And they put emphasis added in here. You could tell that the person in the court was very adamant in their perspective of this, and I absolutely agree with them. Absent a legitimate peniological purpose, the type of touching involved in, for instance, a body cavity search would undoubtedly be cruel and unusual, and a desire to humiliate the inmate or to gratify the officer, inferred through the officer's conduct, is a reasonable way to distinguish between invasive touching that is permitted by law to ensure safety and that which is not. Intended to humiliate the victim or gratify assailant's sexual desires can violate a prisoner's constitutional rights, whether or not the force is exerted by the assailant is significant. By sexual abuse, they mean coerced sexual contact that is engaged by correctional official to humiliate a prisoner, to maliciously and sadistically harm a prisoner, or to sexually gratify a correctional officer. Preferential treatment or disciplinary action also can constitute abuse in violation of the Eighth Amendment. And the sexual abuse, coercion, and threats, preferential treatment, or disciplinary action is referring to the abuse from correctional officers to inmates. They note that objectively serious sexual contact sufficient to establish an Eighth Amendment claim would include sexualized fondling, coerced sexual activity, combinations of ongoing harassment and abuse, and exchanges of sexual activity for special treatment or to avoid discipline. That's the Brown versus Riley case. And in 2010, and the Walker versus Freeman case in 2009. Holding that a prisoner stated a claim under the Eighth Amendment when a sheriff failed to remove a deputy despite knowing the deputy used threats to force the prisoner to perform and submit to sexual acts. So all of these references to previous cases are justifications for the investigation and court references in order to justify their perspective, their points, and what they're saying in that these are constitutional rights. They were proven that were violated, proven in these cases. So deliberate indifference may be established where a jurisdiction fails to protect prisoners from obvious and known risks, including sexual harassment, physical assault, and coerced intimate relationships at the hands of corrections officers. And that is the JKV versus Polk County case in 2020, upholding a jury verdict finding deliberate indifference where the municipality's policies and practices fail to prevent and detect sexual abuse. See also the Cash versus County of Erie case in 2011, upholding a Monell jury verdict because knowledge that an established practice has proved insufficient to deter lesser sexual misconduct can be found to serve as notice that the practice is also insufficient to deter more egregious misconduct. In 2003, Congress enacted the Prison Rape Elimination Act, PREA, to combat sexual abuse in correction settings. And let me just say about PREA, it is used as a weapon from inmate to inmate, from inmate to officer, from officer to inmate. Usually very, very little on the other hand of that. I don't think I've actually ever heard of a recorded case. But in the Prison Rape Elimination Act, you automatically go to confinement while you're being investigated. So during the time, if someone writes a grievance in a Prison Rape Elimination Act form, they are doing it on somebody else, saying that they feel threatened, they were raped, or they have been molested, or they feel as if that is going to happen. And also, if you even admit to being in a relationship with someone, that violates the PREA agreement because inmates do not have consensual rights. So they see that as a violation as well. And you will be put in the investigation, and the minimum is usually 6 months, and it can vary after the if the investigation is found faulty in between. But the normal investigation time where I was at Lowell was 6 months. And in cases that inmates would use it against other inmates, it would be people getting mad at their girlfriends. They don't want them to be with anyone else. And so they would write a PREA form, admit what was happening, and they would both end up going to confinement for investigation. Also, other times it would be trying to take people's game time, trying to prevent them going home. People wouldn't want their girlfriends to leave, or they just had beef with other people, and they would try to prevent them from getting their game time and put them under investigation in the meantime. So the PREA standards require zero tolerance for sexual abuse and sexual harassment of prisoners and detail a series of policy and practice reforms aimed at reducing correctional sexual abuse and sexual harassment and ensuring an adequate response to allegations of sexual abuse or sexual harassment. Although noncompliance with a PREA standard alone is not sufficient to support a finding of constitutional violation, the PREA standards provide notice to jurisdictions of their obligations to protect prisoners from sexual abuse and harassment. Knowledge of and failure to comply with the PREA standards can serve as further evidence of subjective recklessness with regard to prisoner safety. And this is the Crawford case that found PREA and state legislative enactments to be reliable evidence of contemporary standards of decency and thus relevant in evaluating whether specific acts of sexual abuse or sexual harassment give rise to an Eighth Amendment claim. See also the Farmer case, adopting subjective recklessness as the test for deliberate indifference under the Eighth Amendment. Contemporary standards of decency must be brought into bear determining whether a punishment is cruel or and unusual. Bass versus Perrin, 1999, and also the Estelle case, 429 U.S. at 102. I have to study more on how to read these correctly. State laws criminalizing sexual abuse by prison staff are important indicia that such acts violate contemporary standards of decency. And see the Penry versus Lionel. Forgive me if I messed that up. And that was in 1989. The clearest and most reliable objective evidence of contemporary values in the legislation enacted by the country's legislators. At the state level, Florida criminalizes sexual relations between a corrections officer and a prisoner. Florida Statute 794.011 4B4E7, making sexual battery by a corrections officer a first-degree felony. Florida Statute 944.35 3B1-2, making sexual misconduct by a corrections officer a third-degree felony. Florida recognizes that because of the imbalance of power between prison staff and prisoners, a prisoner cannot consent to sex with an officer. Consent is not a defense. This is what I mean when I said before that inmates do not have the ability to consent. We have our rights taken away from us, and the fact that at any point of time, the imbalance of power can be used, as I said before, of taking, and they've noted in the investigation as well, withholding from them their canteen, withholding from them their hygiene and visitation, and in threatening them that if they do not continue the sexual acts, that they'll also continue violating them. So, the consent of the inmate to any act of sexual misconduct may not be raised as a defense, and that's the Florida Statute 794.011E7, criminalizing sex between a corrections officer and a prisoner, where the prisoner may reasonably believe that the offender is in a position of control or authority. Ferrets out. This is Sly, everyone. Sly says hello. He's helping out. So, Florida contemporary standards of decency permit a broad array of staff sexual misconduct, including non-penetrative sexual contact and sexual abuse of prisoners that does not result in any physical injury. Under PREA, rape includes not only penetration, but oral sodomy, sexual assault with an object, and sexual fondling. Likewise, the Prison Litigation Reform Act permits prisoners to recover damages based on, among other things, emotional injury due to sexual abuse. See Garner's again, noting that Congress itself implicitly recognized that sexual abuse of prisoners does not comport with contemporary standards of decency when it amended the Prison Litigation Reform Act to allow prisoners to recover damages for mental or emotional injury suffered while in custody without a prior showing of physical injury, when the prisoner can demonstrate the commission of a sexual act as the basis for the damage he seeks. In addition, the Fourth Amendment guarantees women prisoners constitutional right to bodily privacy with regard to strip searches and unnecessary viewing of their unclothed bodies by male correctional staff, because most people have a special sense of privacy in their genitals, and involuntary exposure of them in the presence of people or the other sex may be especially demeaning and humiliating. See Fortner versus Thomas, 983. I'm going to end this part here. I'm going to pick right back up with the sexual abuse as soon as I post these two videos. I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of the beginning. If you like the video so far, please like and subscribe. It gets a lot worse. Please, I should have gave a trigger warning at the beginning. Future videos, it's pretty rough. The amount of things that everyone has to go through there, and I hope that me bringing it to light and showing this 36-page investigation, reading it to you while you're cleaning your room or while you're just working out or something, maybe I can shed some light on the Eighth Amendment violations and other violations that are going on in the system. So if you like, please let me know, like and subscribe, and comment down below if you have any comments, any opinions, please, questions. I would love to answer them. And I hope I get to see you guys next time. Shalom, me homies. Have a good night.